Hello and welcome to this instance of the Chinese Business History webinar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm Ghassan Moazin, an assistant professor here at the Institute, and I'm also joined today by my colleague Dr. John Wong, who is also part of the Business History subgroup here at the Institute. So today we're very lucky and happy to welcome to the webinar Dr. Peter Thilly, from the University of Mississippi, who will be talking about his just recently published book, The Opium Business, A History of Crime and Capitalism in Maritime China, which just came out from Stanford University Press. So please make sure to have a look at it. But yeah, we're very lucky that he has agreed to talk to us about his book today. Before I hand things over to Peter, I think those of you that attend these webinars generally will be already familiar with the structure, but in general we'll have around half an hour of presentation and then followed by half an hour or so of Q&A. If you have any questions you would like to ask, please just submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and I will then read them out for Peter to reply to during the Q&A period. But without taking up any more time, Peter, if you're ready, please feel free to get started.
All right, thanks so much. I'm going to share a screen here and do it that way. And then, is that right? Looks okay?
That looks good. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks to everybody for showing up. Really excited to share my work here. I really kind of my first book talk as such since the publication. So I'm going to focus my talk here on a bit of evidence from the first chapter of the book, but I include a summary of the book's argument early on. And then at the end, I'm going to give a quick breakdown of the chapters as well. Happy in the question and answer to talk about any of the historical eras that the book covers, including the 20th century. But we're going to start here today in Shenhu Bay in coastal southern Fujian, about halfway between Hong Kong and Shanghai, about halfway between Xiamen and Quanzhou, if you know that part of the world. If you could have taken this photo in the 1830s, we would have seen, a lot more boats, right? Large and small sailing vessels coming in and out of the bay, fishing and trading boats carrying local seafood, bean cake fertilizer from North China, Southeast Asian produce like rice, betel nut, the cotton handkerchiefs that local seamen wore tied around their heads, imported from Manila, manufactured in England. So I visited this place, Shenhu Bay and Yako Village, where I took the photo for the first time in 2019 after having spent about a decade wondering about the view from this beach. The view I'm showing you here, it doesn't look like a lot, but it was an incredibly important piece of evidence for me. I'd wondered for years about visibility, whether or not a person on the shore of the bay could see the opposite side, whether you could see ships anchored at the mouth of the bay, as you can see one in this photo, right? Whether you could see smaller boats plying between those large ships and the villages on the shore. And the answer, obvious, is yes, right? But I had reason to be curious about this. Shenhu Bay was an epicenter of the illegal opium import trade for almost 30 years, from 1835 to around 1862. British ships were anchored illegally in this bay, selling opium more or less every day for the entire duration of those 30 years. They were not hidden from sight, and neither were their customers. So the origin of this book, The Opium Business, lies in a short case about the murder of a customs officer in 1875, which I found during my first semester in graduate school. This is a story about opium that had a lot of elements that were sort of confusing to me. The drug was legal in those years, I learned, but people were smuggling it because of high taxes. The murdered customs officer was British, but he was working for the Qing state, collecting taxes on foreign trade. Now, all of this is probably super familiar to everybody, but I was new, right? There was a lot going on and it was confusing to me. So while I puzzled that out, I set about reading the scholarship on opium in China. There's a lot of good books, right? Cultural histories of opium use, detailed explanations of the buildup to the 1839 Opium War, more than a few books about the institutions and social movements behind opium prohibition. A lot to learn, but some of my basic questions were just not answered in the scholarship. So those questions summarized here are the guiding research questions of the book. How did the people who bought and sold opium make their money? How did they interact with the state? And how did this change over time? These are questions that even the best histories of opium in China didn't answer in a satisfying way. So from the beginning, I felt that answering those questions would, at a minimum, provide a legible, usable chronology of opium's history in China. It's kind of a baseline service to the field, right? So the first 4 chapters of the book do this, just sort of explaining how the business changed over time through its rise as a contraband item, through 20 years of what I call negotiated illegality after 1843 and the opening of the treaty ports, through another 60 or so years of de facto legality until 1906, and then after that period, a new moment of sort of uneven and unsuccessful prohibition characterized by increased centralization and state efforts to control the business from the top down. So that aside, sort of beyond clarifying the timeline of opium's modern history, when I set out, I also felt I could demystify opium, make it less special, study it as a commodity, right? An item of exchange and consumption in the late imperial and then modern world economy, right? This was shipped and warehoused with other items. It was in the same boats, the same banks. It was bought, sold, and consumed by the same people who were buying and selling sugar and tea and other things, cotton, right? So my editor came up with the book's subtitle, A History of Crime and Capitalism in Maritime China, and I think it's accurate. I think it's a history of capitalism in the sense that it explores the evolution of a particular industry, the sale and distribution of a globalized agricultural trade commodity, how this changed over time from the late 19th to the early 20th century. And it provides an analysis of business-state relations within that industry. What I found was that opium was special. I couldn't get away from that, right? It was special in its moral and legal status. This special status is, in fact, the opportunity that opium provides to say something new within this scholarship, the history of capitalism broadly conceived. But in particular, commodity histories. Opium was both ordinary and ubiquitous, but it was also illegal often. And when it wasn't illegal, it was still sort of like illicit or sort of subversive. There was a particular regulatory and moral context that surrounded opium throughout its modern history. As an industry, it developed a particularly thorny relationship, antagonistic and codependent with the people and institutions of state power. So my argument in the book is that opium traders mattered. They shaped the Qing state's approach to legalizing and taxing the drug. When the drug was brought out into the open in the late 1850s, the people at the heights of the business worked with officials to determine tax rates and quotas, to collect those taxes, to regulate the transport and distribution of the drug. Opium traders made themselves indispensable as sources of state revenue. And through their interactions with local officials, opium became one of the fiscal cornerstones of the militarizing late Qing state. So this basic framework, I argue, is not unique in the region. And I'm going to sort of set that aside here in the interest of time. But if people want to kind of talk about comparisons with other states in Asia, in particular Southeast Asia, I'm happy to sort of talk that through. But I want to start a single story here, an example from the first chapter of the book, and start at the beginning. Opium in its modern smokable form came to China from through the diaspora in places like modern Malaysia and Indonesia. Middle Eastern and Dutch merchants had supplied Southeast Asian markets with Indian opium since at least the early 17th century. And the diaspora in early modern Southeast Asia was big, right, as we know. It came almost exclusively from 2 provinces, from Fujian, where my story takes place, and neighboring Guangdong, where many of you are, right? So in the 18th and early 19th century, longstanding mercantile and migratory networks extending out of Fujian and Guangdong connected the Qing Empire's economy to maritime Southeast Asia. Traders from coastal southern Fujian followed seasonal and regional production and wind patterns, bringing Chinese tea and Taiwanese camphor metal cookware from China to Southeast Asia, and in the summer monsoon returning back to Fujian with Southeast Asian rice and sugar and medicinal commodities, and more each year, Indian opium. And so in the 1830s, these three things happened, or several things happened, right? The opium trade took off. The Malwa region of India, there's this new alternative to the British East India Company monopoly opium from Bengal. So they redouble their efforts in Bengal. And then in the marketing end, in China, the 1834 is the end of the British East India Company's monopoly, which opens the door for specialized private firms to engage in various types of competition in opium smuggling. And so the raw numbers are sort of staggering from the 1830s. Prior to 1820, the peak was a few thousand chests of the drug annually. By 1830, 30,000 chests every year into China, and 40,000 by the end of the decade. So my big question is like, how, right? How was this managed? It's an awful lot of illegal drugs to import and distribute illegally, right? This was prohibited, we know. So at the moment of import, transactions between the British sellers and the Chinese buyers took place offshore, removed by a small distance from the Qing officials charged with prohibiting the trade. And so the small island of Linton in the Pearl River Delta was the sort of epicenter of this since the 1820s. Home to a collection of receiving ships, these giant hulks that served as floating warehouses. So the system there was this long-standing, simple, effective smuggling mechanism where buyers could go to local banks, get a receipt, take them out to the boat, and pick up their opium. And many of these buyers came from the province of Fujian and worked to transport the drugs to other major ports, right? So they brought the drugs up the coast to Shanghai or Tianjin or these other ports where the cargo would be split up and diverted to the various markets across China. Traders from Shenhu Bay were worked into this system through a triangular trade route that they ran, wherein they carried opium north up the coast and then across to Taiwan. They carried Taiwanese sugar to Ningbo and the Yangtze River Valley, and they carried Jiangnan cottonware south back to Fujian. And then in the early 1830s, the merchants of Shenhu Bay and neighboring Xiamen and Quanzhou caught a break that improved the logistics of their operation. British opium importers started sending ships up to them to conduct the wholesale trade there rather than at Linton. So this basic phenomenon, the migration of around half the opium imports up the coast from Linton to southern Fujian, is the subject of chapter 1 of my book. So that my entry into this research that became this chapter was the document pictured here, a 17-page memorial from the Governor General of Fujian and Zhejiang provinces to the Daoguang Emperor's Grand Council in Beijing. So a memorial on a criminal matter like this is the final wrapped up version of a case written maybe a year after the events it describes based on the governor's reading of reports, documents on the case from the local officials. And the one pictured here describes the opium operations of a man named Shi Hou, a resident of Yako village in Jinjiang County, Fujian province. It describes how Shi and his fellow lineage members enticed the foreign opium merchants Big and Little Li north from Guangdong into Fujian to establish a smuggling depot at Shenhu Bay. At the end of the case, there's 111 individuals listed as having been arrested or at large and wanted for opium crimes related to the case. The story. Shi Hou, Shi Shubao, and Shi Gui are all members of the Shi lineage of Yako village in Jinjiang County, where I took that photo. Even today, basically this entire village is inhabited by people with this surname, maybe 10,000 people. Lineages like this could be huge, with their own internal class divisions, intra-lineage feuds even, right? This one, the Shi lineage of Yako village, is an especially prominent lineage within the region because of their longstanding connections to the Fujian Navy, as well as they date their ancestry back to the 16th century patriarch Shilang, who the guy who helped the conquering Qing dynasty establish control in the region. So these three guys, Shi Hou and his bros, right? This gang here were of the petty merchant kind of transport labor class. They clearly had access to some money as well. According to what Shurho testified after his capture, before dying in custody, the three of them sold cotton cloth for a living, traveling between Fujian and the port of Shantou in neighboring Guangdong. One day in 1832, while visiting Shantou, a local acquaintance named Wang Mazhi convinced them that they could make a lot more money if they just started bringing their opium north to Shanhubei rather than selling cloth. So they agreed. The three men traveled to Macau with their new friend. They brought around $480 worth of opium, a little bit less than a full chest. And then they brought it back to Fujian for resale. One of them, Shi Shubao, stayed on in Macau to learn the business. And this kind of continued for a few years. And then in June of 1835, Shurho decided it was inconvenient to be trucking up and down the coast all the time. Wouldn't it be nice if their foreign partners, these they call them Macau-born foreigners, Big and Little Lee, wouldn't it be nice if they brought a boatload or two of the drug up to Fujian instead? Everybody said, okay, good idea. And that summer, Big and Little Lee made their first trip to Shanhubei. The testimony in the document states that the deal that brought Big and Little Lee north to Fujian was a guarantee from Shurho and Shi Shubao that for the purchase of 6 chests and 27 balls of opium at $3,200. After the ship's arrival in Fujian, Shurho is described as having brokered various other deals for lineage members and people in neighboring villages. In the most conspicuous example, Shurho charged one of his gentry kinsmen, a Jiansheng, or student of the Imperial College, charged him $600 in brokerage fees to act as intermediary in his purchase of opium from the foreigners, a $10 fee on 60 chests of opium. The wholesale price would have been over $30,000. This is the only evidence about truly large-scale brokerage that we know must have been happening, and the other purchases tally to only around 27 chests. So, in a moment, I'm going to kind of start drawing out some of the limitations of the Qing. Don't try to read this. This is just going to give you a headache. Give you a sense of what I was working with. In a moment, I'm going to kind of draw out some of the limitations of the Qing memorial as a source on this case. But I do want to kind of demonstrate some of the ways that this document provides really useful and unique information. As I mentioned earlier, it names 111 people as perpetrators of various opium-related crimes. Each of them is listed by name, often with the amount of money that they either invested in opium or that they earned through the transport of other people's opium. It's probably the most expansive piece of evidence I was able to find about the petty investors and wage laborers of the opium business. And I'll keep my conclusions for this brief here. The wage laborers earned only slightly more than they would have doing other work, transporting other commodities. In contrast, the investors, some of them very small scale, petty investors, reaped in profits, often reinvesting very quickly into more opium. They generally seem to have done well. In one or two cases, boat owners, people of modest means, petty transport business owners transitioned from carrying other people's opium to investing in their own cargoes of the drug. Finally, when the crackdown happened, the investors almost universally escaped capture, while the wage laborers bore the brunt of all of the state violence associated with this, right? There's a particular logic of illegal drug trading in this evidence, the kind of hyper profitability of even small scale drug dealing, and the unequal assumption of risk between labor and ownership that's probably legible to scholars of narco trafficking and drug dealing from other places in more recent years. Okay, so escaping that awful spreadsheet graphic, returning to the basic narrative of the memorial that Shurho enticed these two foreigners, Big and Little Lee, north to Fujian. It's a fascinating story. It's also a bit fishy. For one, Shurho's partners, Big and Little Lee, had been visiting Shanhubei regularly since 1832. This was my most kind of embarrassingly noisy archival discovery. The brothers John and Thomas Reese, who worked for rival firms and hated each other, Big and Little Lee, Li Chuanzhu, right? Captain Lee. Thomas was captain of the Lord Amherst, which was a ship owned by Dent and Company. And his brother John was captain of a series of different ships owned by Jardine Matheson and Company. For 7 years, from 1832 to 1839, these two men were in competition. They were stationed almost exclusively in Shanhu Bay, selling opium, competing with each other, undercutting each other's prices, lying to each other, signing price fixing agreements and breaking them, hating each other, complaining about each other's bad faith. It's pretty funny in the sources. So pictured here is a letter from one of John Rees's contacts on shore in Yako village, somebody in the Sher lineage probably, requesting that Rees vacate Shanhu Bay for a brief time due to an impending government raid on opium traders. This is from over a year after Sherho was arrested, by the way. The trade continued on after that wave of arrests. The 111 people were not essential, I guess, right? Sherho wasn't essential to the business. These were educated, well-connected people that Rees was dealing with on shore. So in the memorial then, it's clear that Sherho is being scapegoated for the presence of these British ships, even as the authors seem to be deliberately concealing from Beijing the extent of the drug trade and the extent of the British presence in Fujian. The 27 chests of opium that those 111 people purchased is laughable. When you look at the Jardine Matheson sources, 27 chests was the work of like a slow Tuesday morning at the Shanhu Bay anchorage. So what else is missing from the picture of the opium trade in Shanhu Bay that we get from the memorial, right? How else might some of these British sources contradict or fill out the story? So the first insight that I gained by reading the sources together was a more accurate picture of the scale and the geography of the import market. The map shown here, I've gathered the best evidence I could about the buyers and sellers who participated. The numbers are lineages that dominated the trade in Jinjiang County. There's just a fraction of the coastline. The X's are British opium anchorages. From the Jardine Matheson sources, I was able to put together that between 1835 and 1839, the 5 years leading up to the Opium War, 60% of the opium brought from India to China was imported or transacted between British seller and Chinese buyer at the anchorages on this map, right? Not in the Pearl River Delta. 20 years earlier, the total opium imports from India to China had peaked at a few thousand chests, maybe worth $1.5 million. In 1835, and remember the numbers only increased after this, in 1835, somewhere between 17,000 and 24,000 chests of opium changed hands at these anchorages, meaning that somewhere between 11 and 19 million dollars were shipped back down to Canton and William Jardine. It's a lot of drugs. It's a lot of drugs. It's a lot of money. Looking at the anchorages again, it seems important to note that Shanhu Bay is the only one that's even remotely hidden from the sight of very prominent officials. And Shanhu Bay is hardly out of sight, as I noted at the beginning. In Xiamen to the south, those anchorages are in direct and plain sight of the naval garrisons on Xiamen and Jinmen. Likewise, the anchorages in Quanzhou Harbor were not in any way hidden from the Quanzhou prefect, the Jinjiang magistrate, or any of the other officials stationed in that city. So there has to be more to the story, obviously, right? But what is that story? How did these kind of lucrative floating businesses coexist with the military and civil authorities who looked out at them across the waves? The Jardine Matheson sources, one cited here on screen, offer some detail. More often than not, the bribery was systematized into a $10 fee per chest collected on board the receiving ships at the moment of purchase so that the chest could be stamped with a chop to indicate payment. Pictured on the top left is one in a long series of Jardine Matheson documents that reference state officers being stationed on board the opium ships to collect this $10 fee. The evidence extending over several years of letters dovetails with the memorial we were just looking at in a really interesting way. If we recall how Sherho charged $10 per chest in what they called a brokerage fee for all of the opium that his neighbors and relatives were buying from the ships, right? What if Sherho was actually not collecting those fees for himself, but for the person who eventually arrested him, right? So we'll get back to that in a second. It seems plausible. Rees and his compatriots even argued about whether or not they were being duped about this fee. You know, maybe it was just a brokerage fee and the lineage was just kind of using its clout to force their neighbors to pay for access to these foreign ships. Once or twice, John Rees and the other captains even went on shore to try and negotiate bribes and regulations with government authorities. Rees would have always preferred to pay the officials himself. His boss, William Jardine, demanded it, but Rees was only very rarely able to do that. The archive is filled with frustrated letters where Rees and these other captains can never really fully crack those relationships between the major opium trading lineages and the officials who required payment. Instead, the negotiation and payment of bribes was managed by leading figures in the lineages who were engaged in the trade in a similar manner, and indeed in concert with their other complex ongoing negotiations and interactions with the state. The Schur lineage achieved some incredible leverage if Rees's sources are to be trusted. He writes in one letter that they successfully earmarked $10,000 of their annual $26,000 bribe for the victims of a lineage feud, which they might otherwise have been seen as culpable for. In another instance, when a new official came in and disrupted the trade, Rees's contacts on shore informed him that the most respectable men in the lineage had activated their contacts in the provincial capital, went over the new official's head, and got him transferred out. So what happened with Schur if their relationship with the state was so cozy? The final conclusion I reached is that they were arrested in curious circumstances, almost certainly related to the non-payment of an expected bribe during the Lunar New Year. In early 1837, right around the New Year, another new official was appointed. And this is a trope, right? There's a constant circulation of officials in this administration. And this time, according to Rees, the lineage elders decided to try and hold back about 1/3 of the bribe he was expecting. And this is ultimately why I think I was able to find that document in the #1 archives in Beijing about 111 people who were arrested for opium crimes. Right, Schur, this guy might have been a double scapegoat. On paper, blamed for the arrival of British ships in southern Fujian, and in practice, killed in retribution for an unpaid bribe that he may or may not have been responsible. It's fun to think about the kind of possibilities here. Wealthy merchants in the region had systematically partnered with officials to provide funds for educational institutions, granaries, soup kitchens, a variety of social welfare institutions. Merchant associations operating between coastal southern Fujian and Taiwan, several prominent ones located on the shore of Shenhu Bay, likewise contributed to public works and temples, cultivating productive relationships with local officials. This is the immediate context for the arrival of the offshore opium market to southern Fujian. When British ships started anchoring near these ports after 1832, powerful figures in the maritime trading community stepped in to negotiate. A system of fees and protection and regulation emerged. Lineage elders met with local officials. They negotiated payments. They negotiated regulations. They created a system of fees that became normalized and standardized with widely known rates, chops or stamps to indicate payment. All of this kind of a system, right? Opium became an object of revenue collection for local officials. They approached it in a systematic way, and the money was spread around through the civil and military bureaucracy, right? How do we decide when it's revenue or a bribe if they're using it to help pay the soldiers, right? These local practices of opium revenue extraction developed in the 1830s provided then the most immediate context for the earliest attempts to formalize opium import and transport taxes in the coming decades. So over the course of the subsequent chapters of the book, I develop an argument that can basically be summarized as follows, right? The people who bought and sold opium exerted a profound amount of agency over the Qing and then later Republican states' regulation of their industry. At the beginning of the story, like I just told, lineage merchants partnered with local naval commanders and came up with a system of revenue collection. In chapter 2, I described the first 2 decades after the opening of the first 5 treaty ports and to foreign trade and consular representation, the aftermath of the Opium War. And during those years, the opium trade remained illegal and the import market continued to be conducted offshore. So this pattern of systematic fee collection in Shenhu Bay, for example, lasted through those years into the early 1860s, in fact. It was only in the late 1850s that opium taxation in the formal sense began to exist when the Qing state authorized 2 new systems of tax collection: an import tax collected at the ports at the moment of import, and then that cluster of territorial transport, distribution, and retail taxes, the most famous of which we know as the lichin. Right? So in Fujian, prominent opium merchants competed with each other to purchase the collection regulatory rights for these transport taxes, and that's the story I tell in chapter 3 of the book. Chapter 4 then demonstrates the continuity in opium regulatory and taxation practices before and after the Prohibition Edicts of 1906. It explains how opium prohibition bureaus and poppy tax collection agencies operated along familiar tax farming lines to the legion bureaus of the 19th century, and how these new institutions took their shape through negotiations between prominent opium merchants and the warlord and Kuomintang authorities who fought over the province. Chapter 5 then pivots to explain the transformed role of coastal southern Fujian in the reoriented global drug trade of the early 20th century, sort of casting a really wide net, especially the League of Nations archive, to kind of understand the tidal wave of opium, morphine, heroin, and cocaine smuggling that came out of China into jurisdictions across South and Southeast Asia before and after World War I. And then the final chapter, chapter 6, explains the role of Japanese citizenship for the people who bought and sold opium during the early 20th century. Japan colonized Taiwan in 1896, and Xiamen, of course, is just a very short journey from there. The majority population of Taiwan when Japan took over were people from or of Southern Fujianese descent. So in that final chapter, I sort of grapple with the phenomenon of flexible citizenship, right? Of 30,000 people by the 1930s who lived permanently in Southern Fujian with Japanese colonial citizenship. Many more, you had fake passports and placards that, fake placards declaring them Japanese. Every opium den in Xiamen was Japanese owned by the 1930s. Every director of an opium prohibition bureau, collector of a poppy tax, had either real or fake Taiwanese citizenship. So there I sort of explore the urban history of Xiamen through the kind of citizenship-based conflicts that characterize the drug industry, and talk about how a coalition of Taiwanese, really Fujianese businessmen established themselves as the leading power in the city about a decade before Japan annexed the port in 1938. All right, I've talked through what I had to say, and I'm really excited to get to your questions.
Yeah, Peter, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I'm really fascinated by the topic. As you say, we always think, I think, as modern historians of China, that we know so much about, or we kind of know the opium story, but you kind of try to really bring us, I suppose, to the economic life of things and how things on the ground actually work. And I think that's really fascinating from the short overview you've given us already. So as I said, we now have some time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A button, and I'll be happy to read them out for Peter to get back to. And we already have our first few questions. So the first question comes from Margaret Tillman, and she says, thanks for this really interesting talk and great presentation. Are you arguing more broadly that decentralization, which Kuhn famously attributed to the aftermath of Taiping Rebellion, can be attributed instead to local bribes regarding the opium business?
I wouldn't put it that strongly. I think there's certainly a relationship to decentralization and bribery. But no, I guess I don't see it that way. I see opium as a taxable resource in the late 19th century, right? And so the provincial governors who are sort of responsible for a lot of this decentralization and building up their arsenals and naval yards and things like that, they taxed the heck out of opium, and that wasn't bribery, right? That was just taxation. Now it was sort of shady taxation, right? And there's like a second level of decentralization that happens with the legion system of hiring, of privatizing the regulation of opium, right? So right in southern Fujian, we're hiring this coalition of really rich opium traders to collect and enforce the taxes, and that's problematic in a whole lot of ways because they have their private armies, and really they're just trying to ice out their competitors, and they're pretty violent and regulated, right? They regulate themselves. It's self-regulating. So that's problematic and a form of I guess decentralization potentially. But yeah, no, I wouldn't sort of say that opium's responsible. I think it's part of the context.
Sure, thank you. We've got a question from Emma Bittinger about sources. So, I mean, I think you've touched upon this in the talk certainly already, but maybe you want to talk a bit more. So she basically asks, how might the different sources you studied and researched, primary, secondary, etc., change the narrative of the opium trade story? How might you interpret the discrepancies between different sources?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about sources. The book is about over 100 years of history, right? So the sources change in each chapter, and each kind of time period offers different kind of opportunities and limitations. So right I gave you the example of the first chapter, right? What I had to work with, the kind of British Jardine Matheson archive and the Qing legal archive, and how super different these things are, right? And they both kind of have their own limitations, and we can kind of triangulate and get to the middle. As you move through time, you don't get so lucky with Jardine Matheson anymore, right? Jardine Matheson is the only opium traders that wrote down diaries and then put them in archives, right? Everybody else kept their businesses secret, who I studied. So really using kind of creative ways to get about this. One of the more kind of interesting things that I didn't expect, talking about sources, was the Singapore newspapers. Proved to be an incredible resource for me, because they talked about opium in a matter-of-fact way that Chinese newspapers didn't. There's this sort of patriotism. All the Chinese newspapers kind of say the same boring stuff about opium, and they don't really talk about the details of who's making money off it. It's kind of not kosher. It's like they say Mo Shang instead of saying the guy's name, right? It's just like some guy bid $300,000 for the provincial legion, so you couldn't even give his name in the newspaper, right? And in Singapore, they did. They were pretty gossipy about who was buying and selling opium in Fujian in the 1920s and 30s. So that was one of the sort of more interesting kind of discoveries I made. But yeah, it's just so tricky because this was an industry that was intended to be secret by the people who practiced it, even when it was legal. That they were very secretive. It's sort of piecing things together in different ways.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the next question was something I was also wondering. It comes from Gerald Chen, and basically asks so how the compradors, the people that normally were sort of the Chinese staff or Chinese partners of foreign firms, how they fit into this. And if I can add to that, because you certainly when you were talking about chapter 1, you stressed the role of the lineage quite a bit. So I wonder whether, did that ever play a role in the recruitment of compradors in these firms?
Yeah, I don't have a lot, right? It's sort of a short window of time where the compradors are going to be really relevant in the opium business, because by the time it's legal, basically by the 1860s, the British firms aren't really buying and selling opium anymore. It's all Chinese firms that are going down to Hong Kong and buying it themselves, right? So that kind of role isn't that important after the 1850s, I guess. In the 1840s and 50s, I'm working on a second book project about the small sword uprising in Xiamen, and really kind of focusing on this comprador, the guy who was executed at the beginning. So I've been thinking about this a lot lately. But yeah, I don't have a great answer for that, in part because of sources, right? The limitation of the Jardine Matheson sources is frequently that you don't get the person's, they just have really incomplete information or a lack of curiosity about their Chinese partners, right? So they refer to him by like a name that's like Ahin, right? Aheen, and they never say anything about where the guy's from or like what his name actually is, or like, it's really hard to sort of get that information a lot of times.
Sure, thank you.
So sorry for the unsatisfying answer there.
Oh, no. The next question comes from Chen Jiahui, and it says, what consequences might have occurred, I guess, or might have occurred if the Qing had legalized opium, and he's now asking about Lin Zexu and whether he supposedly was fine with local opium, basically, was just not happy with foreign opium.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, in those years, the counterfactual is tough. You know, I don't like violence, so like it's hard for me to read these sources of people getting executed for buying and selling stuff that everybody thought was normal, right? So I'm certainly on the side of like there could have been other ways to go about dealing with this crisis if it needs to be perceived as a crisis. Yeah, my issue, my counterfactual is usually more like, what if the revenue could have been collected in a more sensible way, like over time? Because I think there was really sort of problematic aspects to the way the revenue was collected. You know, on the one hand, the taxing imports was limited by these unequal treaties, right? So they weren't able to tax the import of opium at a fair rate. And so that's part of the reason why they so aggressively taxed the domestic transport of opium. And that aggressive taxation of the domestic transport of opium caused just an enormous amount of problems. So it's a sort of chain reaction that really, you know, the unequal treaty is responsible for, mostly.
Yeah. Well, next is, I think, more of a comment of our colleague, Professor Elizabeth Sin. She just says she wants to suggest Melissa McCullough's Distant Shores Colonial Encounters on China's Maritime Frontier, which provides very interesting material about how different Chaozhou groups dominated the opium trade around Shantou, with, of course, strong connections to Southeast Asia. Also about Chaozhou syndicates successfully bidding for opium farms in different jurisdictions, and she then later says that would be a good comparison to Fujian. But I think you worked with Professor McCauley.
Yes, Melissa is my advisor at graduate school, and yeah, in chapter 4 I do have a lot of conversation, chapter 3 rather, about the competition between basically Shantou and Xiamen as like import ports, sort of changing the tax rate in each port to try to draw more of the opium trade to one port or the other. So I'm definitely really interested in that connection and comparison.
Yeah, thanks. Next question comes from Nancy Lee and is about Hong Kong. Can you touch on the opium merchants in Hong Kong? Was the trade licensed by the British, and how long did this carry on legally?
So I don't know a lot about Hong Kong. My understanding is basically beginning in 1843 or so, when the treaty ports open, Linton sort of shuts down as Hong Kong can turn into this entrepot, a free trade entrepot, right? So opium was only taxed in Hong Kong. There was an opium consumption tax, right? Or like, what would it be? Retail, right? There's a local kind of retail monopoly within Hong Kong that's farmed out to various merchants, and it's the boiling the opium into paste and selling it retail is taxed. But the actual, right, we're getting like 5,000 chests of opium off of a boat and like putting 3 more on another boat. None of that's taxed. I believe. So that's kind of like how it worked. I don't know a lot about how those business transactions worked. I don't know who the people were that did them. So yeah, I don't have a lot to say about Hong Kong. It would have been a whole different book.
Yeah, thank you. The next question comes from Wai Lo. I'm interested in Japanese participation in the opium trade. Could you say more about the people with flexible Japanese or Taiwanese citizenship in Fujian and other treaty ports in the area?
Yeah, so it's a really kind of a fascinating story to me. You know, some of them, speaking of, there's a handful of like really powerful people who come out of this community of people who have Taiwanese citizenship. And some of them, you can call them all Taiwanese, and some of them were born in Taiwan and ended up coming to Xiamen in the teens or so. And some of them never seem to ever have been to Taiwan, are from southern Fujian, but somehow managed to get Taiwanese citizenship. But basically, by 1923, 24 or so, every single warlord or kind of naval authority, Xiamen had this sort of series of different people in charge, kind of in the early 1920s, and then sort of stabilized. But every government over and over again, as they sort of redecided how to do opium prohibition, farmed out the Opium Prohibition Bureau, sold it off to somebody with Taiwanese citizenship. So the logic was basically that if they didn't give this community kind of a stake in the ownership of the opium monopoly, they would just break the opium monopoly, and the Japanese consul wouldn't punish them for it. So basically sort of bullied the local administration into kind of accepting them. And so poppy tax collection in the countryside under various kind of warlords was contracted out to these same people, as well as the distribution within the city. And then you kind of look further, and there's other, I noticed the other attendees here that know more about this than me. So we can wait for James Gary and Sean's book, for example. But this, there's this one guy, Zhang Hokun, who is responsible for what Xiamen looks like today, where there used to be a large bay, sort of filled it in, that artificial kind of lake in Xiamen. His firm did that in the early 1920s, and he's also collecting poppy tax money and Prohibition Bureau money and things like that. So the sort of urban history of Xiamen is hard to tell without this community.
Yeah, thank you. The next question comes from our colleague Peter Hamilton. He says, in the context of Hong Kong, many former opium merchants or investors later, quote-unquote, made good by investing in real estate, donating to educational or medical institutions, joining colonial governing bodies, etc. The example that pops to mind is Lee Hai-sen of Lee Theatre and Lee Gardens. In your research, did you find, I guess, many examples of that in mainland China as well? Or is that exclusive to more formally colonial contexts?
I don't. I was sort of expecting to find that kind of thing. And I never really found an example of somebody who was sort of a famous opium trader who didn't end badly, right? Especially because most of the folks that I learned about in the 1920s and 30s, their lives ended sometime during the Japanese invasion or the Civil War, right? So a lot of people kind of died in violent ways that might have otherwise kind of turned to philanthropy, right, if geopolitics hadn't gotten in the way. Folks from the 19th century, I bet that's true. The issue is the reticence of such as Shenbao and other Chinese newspapers to name them, right? I wasn't able to learn who bought these opium monopolies sort of 9 times out of 10. It was very rare that I was able to kind of find the name of a firm or a person who kind of ran one of these big opium monopolies in the 19th century. So those would be the people to look for that kind of thing. And unfortunately, I just couldn't find them.
Yeah, thanks. I think the next question sort of, also goes into a similar direction. It's come from Ning Run Dong, and the question is whether any major corporations were involved in the opium trade. I guess it depends on how you define major corporations, but
yeah, sure. Jardine, we were talking in the lead up to this, right? I had to get permission from the lawyers of Jardine Matheson, which is still a company, to view their materials and to publish the book, and hopefully, they don't get mad at me. He never wrote back after I asked permission to publish the book, so kind of never really slept too well at night about that. as far as other corporations, in the 20th century, once, I mentioned chapter 5 deals with the export of opium overseas, as well as like the export of other drugs, right? Cocaine, especially, was really moving through the city of Xiamen. And early, that was a lot of the big drug companies that you know now. So they were smuggling in, Bayer, cocaine, and other kind of these big German drug companies in the early 20th century, really until World War I or so, and then kind of Japanese production took over. So there are some drug companies that get mentioned in the book.
Oh, thanks. Interesting. The next question comes from Marlon Zhu from the Academia Sinica. And he asks about periodization. So why did the quote-unquote Shenghu period end in the 1860s? Is there any kind of connection, he asks, to the maritime customs systems and the establishment of the Chinese Maritime Customs Service?
Yeah, so Shenghu Bay it was so weird that it lasted into the 1860s because it was just so very illegal, right? It was a non-treaty port, and that's there were not supposed to be boats in that place. Like, never mind selling opium. It basically is exactly right. It is the opening of the Maritime Customs Service and the collection of taxes there. They kind of had like this, what seems to have been a workaround permission. The Quanzhou prefect seems to have had an arrangement with the authorities in Fuzhou, because he was always fighting. Basically, that's the Shenzhou anchorage and the Quanzhou anchorages. The authorities in Xiamen, the Daotai in Xiamen, always wanted to shut them down, and the Quanzhou prefect wanted to keep them open because he was the one getting their taxes. And so the Daotai would sort of issue edicts to clear the boats out of Shenzhou, and then somebody would show up at the boats with a note from the prefect saying, "Ignore those edicts from the Daotai. You could stay here. It's fine." So that happened kind of over and over again in the 1850s. And then finally, once the Maritime Customs opened and there's an official opium tax that they're legally allowed to collect, they can't have that kind of backdoor situation anymore.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. The next question comes from Margaret Silman again. It's just asking whether you'd like to talk about how you got permission to view the business archives, I suppose, of Jardine Matheson.
Yeah, so that one's not too tough. John's also, I think, worked there before or communicated with them. It's I think you first get in touch with the librarian at Cambridge and tell them that you're interested in coming, and then they tell you to, now get a permission from the Jardine Matheson lawyer. And if he's in the mood, he'll respond to you. They don't seem to be very touchy, like, about what you're gonna. They know that they sold opium, right? It's not. I don't think they're expecting it to turn into anything terribly controversial.
Yeah, thank you. We have a comment from James Garian Chen, who I think you mentioned earlier, and it says, sort of an answer to Peter Hamilton's question based on what Peter Thilly just said. The quote-unquote Taiwanese in the 20s and 30s transitioned into or simultaneously pursued real estate investment and urban or provincial philanthropy. The Wufeng Lins and Bianchao Lins are probably the best example of this, but like Peter mentioned, what happens during the war is a little murky, at least to me. Yeah. No, that's yeah.
But Peter, if you don't mind me jumping in here, I guess to triangulate some of the questions, there's the issue of access to some of the business archives. And that's also the issue of how a historian would approach the materials. It is somewhat unfortunate that Jardine Matheson is the only set of archives that we have access to on this business. It's not even open secret. I mean, we knew that many of these places along the coast operated, or their existence was primarily underwritten by the opium business. But then many firms, especially those in existence right now, is still very cautious about letting us look at the archives. So maybe we can reflect a little bit more on what opportunities there might be if people are getting more comfortable about that, and also somewhat of a secondary question. When I wrote on this business, very much on the periphery, unlike your masterpiece, I get asked a lot, the moral question, how do you feel about that? I mean, do we need to feel about it? Just like people write on the history of religion, do not need to believe in the religion. I think, the focus on our work can be not one of morality, but, as you do, understand the mechanism of the business and how it functioned during a particular period of time. That's totally legitimate. I wonder how you feel about that.
Yeah, really, really good questions. I mean, with the archives, I was thinking also, the Augustine Hurd archives at Harvard have some stuff a little bit. I wasn't able to use it that much. I think for people kind of interested in, if there is like interest in looking into this in other places, it's really, I think, going to be local stuff. You get some of the best things I found were at the Xiamen Public Library, where they have all these digitized kind of local newspapers that you can't really get anywhere else unless you go to that public library. And then it's a huge amount of information about kind of the early 20th century and stuff like that. So I imagine other places are going to have other, maybe other companies that were involved there. There's other opportunities. So you have to be creative, I guess, to study drugs. As far as the moral question, yeah. My feeling is, I sort of mentioned it before, is like what upsets me most in the sources is the violence, the actual exercise of like really violent power, right, and the accumulation of huge amounts of money and authority and violence that way, right? So that's how I've sort of approached this, is kind of trying to understand the money and power connection that must have been there, right? The big kind of moral story of like Britain sort of national crime, China national victim is like indisputable, but also not terribly interesting to talk about, or like I don't know, and maybe other people feel really differently, and I don't mean to be dismissive. I just felt like that the connection between kind of money and power within the opium story was one that needed exploration.
All right, great. I think that's a wonderful point because we're already running up against time. It's a wonderful point to close maybe for this session of the webinar. So what remains for me to do, Peter, is to thank you again for taking the time to talk to us about your wonderful book and to answer all the questions very, very patiently. Yeah, I should mention we the next Chinese Business History webinar will be taking place on the 21st of April when Carlis Wazabrogli will be talking about his research on a Chinese engineering firm in during World War II, and so we're very much looking forward to that, and I hope to see many of you there. But until then, again, thank you, Peter, and thank you to all of you for attending, and see you all soon, hopefully. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.